Okay guys, and finally let's talk thyroid hormone and its effects primarily on metabolism, which as you will find out is mostly what thyroid hormone does. It is secreted from the follicular cells in the thyroid gland. We will be going over in some detail how thyroid hormone is produced in those follicular cells in your second year when we get to the sort of endocrine portion of the curriculum. Release is stimulated by TSH from the anterior pituitary, so we're going to be talking about the hypothalamic pituitary target organ system again. It is bound to plasma proteins because for the most part in the bloodstream, and a lot of this is bound to thyroid binding globulin, a specialized protein for this purpose. And it enters the cell by an energy-dependent process, so it can't just cross the membrane, but it does act in the nucleus, just like steroid hormones do to alter gene transcription, and it changes the expression of a lot of different proteins, which is the primary way in which it changes metabolism. So growth is affected. We'll talk a little bit more about that in your second year. But definitely needed, particularly for development of the brain, and it controls metabolic rate, and that's its primary purpose here. And as you will find out, it interacts with the sympathetics and reinforces their actions. The two work together very well to produce a systemic response to metabolism. We'll talk a little about that. So basically, the reason why these two interact synergistically, I'm going to show you another way in which this happens in terms of thermogenesis at the very end of this lesson. But generally speaking, bear in mind that your catecholamines, just like the other hormones that we've talked about up to this point, they increase substrate levels in the plasma, and that's their primary job. So catecholamines act with thyroid hormone very well, because while the catecholamines keep the substrate levels up, thyroid hormones allows you to better utilize it within the tissue. In other words, it increases metabolism within the tissue so that you can use the glucose better. At the same time, the catecholamines increase the substrate in the plasma. So the two work together to make a better functioning system in the face of stimuli for release. Okay? There are two kinds of thyroid hormone. There is T3, which is the more active hormone. It's designated 3 because it has 3 iodines on the aromatic rings here, here, and here. And we have T4, which is the less active form, and it has 4 iodines on these aromatic rings here. Okay? I'm not particularly worried that you know the biochemistry from my own lessons, but you should recognize that these two things are different and what the difference between the two of them is. What you're going to find out is that T4 is the primary form that is released from the thyroid gland with a little bit of T3, but the T4 is converted to T3 at the target sites, at the tissues, and the T3 is the active form, and it's going to be the form that mediates most of the effects that you see on the tissue level. Okay, so this is the form that you see mostly in the blood from the thyroid gland. This is the form that's mediating most of the effect. This is converted to this in the tissues. And finally, we have this RT3, which is just a different isoform, and now your 3 iodines are on the different aromatic rings. It's an inactive form that you will see. So control of release, again, through the hypothalamic pituitary target organ system, again, a very familiar system, I hope, to you now. We have our hypothalamus here in the brain, and it is connected to the pituitary by the stalk, so there's a portal system, capillary bed here, portal system in between, and then the pituitary secretes hormones which find their way through the circulatory system to the target organs, in this case the thyroid gland. So we have our hypothalamus secreting TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone, okay? The TRH, just like the other hormones that we've talked about that are produced by the hypothalamus, is transported through the portal system to the anterior pituitary, where it stimulates the release of TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone. And then we have TSH stimulating the thyroid gland to secrete primarily T4 with just a little bit of T3, okay? The T4 is transported through the bloodstream to the peripheral tissues where it is converted to T3. T3 is your major, your hormone that has most of the effects. It's the most active form. It has its effect on the peripheral tissues. Note that T4 and T3 both feed back upon both the pituitary and the hypothalamus. So again, this is an example of negative feedback. You don't want too much T4 or T3 and or T3. You want to keep it within normal levels. It's okay to let them get high if they need to be high, but you don't want them to get too high. So you keep these levels under control through negative feedback. T4 and T3 feed back to reduce TSH release and keep the release of T4 and T3 under control if they get too high. And they feed back upon the hypothalamus, which will decrease TRH, which will decrease TSH, which will decrease T4 and T3. And again, keep them under control if they get too high. So levels of these that get too high feed back upon this system, and the levels are kept under control by negative feedback. Okay? All right. Notice these are all what we call long loops. That is, the T4 and T3 come from your target organs. So they're feeding back through the whole circulatory system back upon the pituitary and the hypothalamus. Now, as I've shown you, sometimes you get feedback of the hormone released from the pituitary back onto the hypothalamus as well. Okay? That does not take place here. TSH does not feed back upon the hypothalamus to decrease its own release. Sometimes the hormones released from the pituitary do. This does not. Okay, and that actually has medical relevance, because what happens is if you get low T4 and T3 levels, hypothyroidism, what you do is the low levels here cause an increase in secretion of TRH and an increase in secretion of TSH. And because the TSH doesn't feed back upon the hypothalamus, the TSH levels get extraordinarily high with hypothyroidism, much higher than you'll see with decreases in some other hormones, okay? And so the very high levels of TSH stimulate this thyroid hormone to grow. It has a trophic effect upon the cells because the TSH is trying like mad to get the thyroid gland to secrete more T4 and T3. And this is why you get an enlargement of the thyroid gland and you get goiters with hypothyroidism. It's because the TSH doesn't feed back upon the TRH to keep itself under control, and instead it goes wild and increases to big levels, and you get an increase in thyroid gland size. Okay? So bear that in mind. It's one of the reasons why you see goiters, big thyroid glands with hypothyroidism. This TSH goes wild and gets extraordinarily high because there's no feedback mechanism. So this tells you why you need negative feedback for hormones, because that can happen to any hormone where there's no negative feedback mechanism involved. You'll have these hormones go wild and they'll have adverse effects. So keeping that under control is something that you want. All right, and finally, these are the effects of thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone binds to, again, it's transported into the cell, it makes its way into the cell, and it binds to thyroid hormone transcription factor, add a transcription factor, and what it does is it increases the expression of proteins, enzymes mitochondrial respiratory enzymes. It increases the sodium potassium ATPase, which, as you know, in many tissues eats up a lot of ATP. The net effect of increasing the expression of these proteins is to increase the metabolic rate and the oxygen consumption, okay, in these cells. And so the effects of thyroid hormone can be tracked pretty much always directly to the effects on metabolism. So I've talked to clinicians before, and I've asked them why is hypothyroidism on the list of differentials for this disease? And a lot of times they'll just tell you, well, because it's always on the list of differentials. And the reason it's always on the list of differentials is because it has all these broad effects on the tissues. And the reason it has all these broad effects on the tissues is because it affects metabolism. And the tissues all have metabolism, and so it really affects pretty much all the tissues. So the increase in metabolic rate will give you an increase in heat generation and an increase in sweating. It gives you an increase in carbon dioxide generation that will increase ventilation. It will also cause you to increase food intake because you need more fuel in order to fuel the increase in metabolic rate. And increases mobilization of endogenous carbohydrate, protein, and fat. It also increases the O2 consumption, and that will increase cardiac output and increase ventilation, as you well know. So pretty much all these effects are traceable to this increased metabolic rate and increased oxygen consumption. And that pretty much explains what thyroid hormone does within the body. All these broad effects are all mediated through this increase in metabolic rate, okay? So these shouldn't be too hard to remember given that that is the case, okay? That's the reason why we're presenting it in the metabolism part of this block. All right, and finally, we have, also related to metabolism, we have thyroid hormone's sort of unique role in generating heat in response to cold, okay? So you have a thermoregulatory control system in your brain at the hypothalamus, really. So you get a sensation of cold, and that increases sympathetic nervous system tone, okay? And what that means, as you guys know, is a release of norepinephrine at nerve endings. And so the norepinephrine binds to adrenergic receptors on brown fat cells. So these cells are full of fat, okay? At the same time, in response to cold, your hypothalamus will release TRH. TRH will lead to the release of TSH from the pituitary, and this will lead to the release of primarily T4 from the thyroid. And that enters the circulation in response to cold, okay? The thyroid hormone makes its way into the cell, is converted to T3, and it does a couple of different things. First, it increases expression of the adrenergic receptor. So now you have a synergistic effect upon your adrenergic response. You have your increase in norepinephrine, which increases binding to adrenergic receptors, and you have this increase in T3, which increases the binding because you're increasing the receptors, okay? It potentiates the effect here. That increases cyclic AMP, as you guys know, through the normal stimulation of adenylate cyclase, okay? And then that increase in cyclic AMP, along with the increase in T3, causes the expression of a protein called UCP1. UCP stands for uncoupling protein, so uncoupling protein 1. What it does is it allows protons to move across this intermitochondrial membrane. So as you guys know by now, the way that your mitochondria make ATP is by generating a proton gradient across the membrane. And as protons are allowed to flow back across the membrane through a channel pore in the ATPase in this membrane, you can use the transport of the protons down their gradient to generate ATP. So that's the way mitochondria normally work. What UCP does is it allows protons to go back across the membrane without generating ATP. So if you allow that to happen, then what you do is you increase enzymatic activity in this membrane. You generate less ATP, and more of the energy in this gradient goes toward generating heat, because all the enzymes that generate the gradient are now operating faster, and they're all more active because you're allowing those protons to flow back across the membrane uninhibited, okay? And so all the enzymes work more quickly in terms of generating the proton gradient, and as that happens, they generate more heat. And so these brown fat cells generate more heat in response to cold and help bring the body temperature back up toward normal. So this is another example of how the thyroid hormones and the sympathetic nervous system are synergistic and interact. The catecholamines interact with the thyroid hormone to produce an effect within the tissues, okay? So this is another reason why the two tend to go hand in hand, okay? That's all I've got. Thank you for your attention.